Along the edge of the White Sea, where the waters stretch into icy stillness and the horizon blurs into endless twilight, lies the Pomor Coast. Here, in the far north of medieval Russia, the land is shaped by the slow, patient hands of frost and tide. The Pomors, fisherfolk, hunters, and salt-makers, lived in harmony with the rhythms of the sea in the long, hushed winters. This is a story not of kings or conquests, but of quiet labor, of nets woven by firelight, of salt harvested from the earth, and of wooden boats that carried men into the whispering waves. To understand the Pomors, we must first know their land. The White Sea, cold and capricious, freezes for half the year, locking villages in a world of snow and silence. The summers are brief but generous, bringing long days where the sun barely sets, and the waters teem with fish, cod, herring, and the prized Atlantic salmon. The Pomors settled in scattered villages along the coast, their homes built from thick pine logs, sturdy against the wind. Each village was small, perhaps a dozen families, bound together by shared labor and the knowledge that survival here depended on cooperation. Inside a Pomor house, the air was warm with the scent of pine resin and drying fish. The izba, as it was called, had low ceilings to hold in heat, and a massive brick stove dominated the space. Here, bread was baked, fish was smoked, and children gathered to listen to tales of the sea. The floors were packed earth, covered in woven reed mats. Near the stove, a wooden bench served as both seat and bed, lined with reindeer hides for warmth. In the corner, a loom stood ready, where women spun wool into thick socks and mittens, dyed blue with lichen gathered from the rocks. Clothing was practical, made to endure. Men wore long tunics of linen or wool, belted at the waist, with trousers tucked into tall boots of seal or reindeer leather. In winter, they layered fur-lined coats, the hoods trimmed with wolf or fox fur to shield their faces from the wind. Women's dresses were similarly layered with embroidered hems, simple patterns of waves and snowflakes, stitched by firelight in the long winter evenings. Outside, the village stirred with quiet industry. Smoke curled from the bathhouse, the banya, where steam and birch branches cleansed both body and spirit. Near the shore, men repaired their boats, the scent of tar thick in the air. Children carried buckets of water from the communal well, their breath fogging in the crisp air. And always there was the sea, sometimes calm, sometimes roaring, but ever present, the giver and taker of life. In the next part, we will step into the daily rhythms of Pomor life, the casting of nets, the salting of fish, and the patient wait for the seasons to turn. When the ice finally loosened its grip on the White Sea, the Pomors prepared their boats. The long winter had been a time of mending nets, carving floats from corkwood, and braiding new ropes from hemp. Now, as the pale sun lingered longer in the sky, the men and boys of the village gathered at the shore, their breaths still visible in the chill morning air. Fishing was not just a trade for the Pomors. It was a way of life, a quiet conversation with the sea. The boats were sturdy, wide-bottomed things, built to withstand the caprices of northern waters. They had no keels, making them easier to haul onto ice or shore. The Pomors called these vessels cocks, and they were built with an almost reverent patience, each plank fitted by hand, caulked with tar-soaked hemp to keep the freezing waters at bay. The nets were woven from flax or hemp, their mesh just wide enough to let young fish slip free. Floats of carved wood or inflated seal bladders kept them near the surface, where the herring swam in shimmering schools. Not all fishing was done with nets. Some Pomors preferred the hook and line, especially for the fat cod that lurked in deeper waters. The hooks were forged from iron, simple and strong, baited with strips of dried fish or even a scrap of bright cloth to lure the curious. A good fisherman knew the sea's moods, where the currents would carry the fish, how the wind might shift by midday. He listened to the gulls, watched the ripples on the water, and sometimes, in the hush of early morning, he simply knew where to cast. The work was slow, methodical. Men sat for hours in the boats, hands calloused from hauling lines, faces weathered by salt and wind. There was no hurry. The sea gave what it would give. When the nets grew heavy, they were drawn in, glistening with fish, heron flashing like silver coins, the occasional cod thrashing in protest. The catch was piled in the bottom of the boat, soon to be cleaned, salted, or pressed for oil. Back on shore, the women and children took over. Fish were gutted with quick, practiced strokes, their innards saved for bait or fertilizer. Some were laid on wooden racks to dry in the wind. Others were packed in barrels with coarse sea salt, where they would keep through the long winter. Nothing was wasted. Even the fish oil, rendered in great iron pots over slow fires, would burn in lamps, casting a warm, smoky glow through the darkest months. The Pomors did not fear hunger, if they respected the sea. They knew when to fish, when to hunt seals, when to gather eggs from the cliffs. Their year was marked not by calendars, but by the turning of the tides, the heron runs of spring, the cod of summer, the last frantic harvest before the ice returned. In the next part, we will step inside the smokehouse, where fish turned golden over smoldering alderwood, and explore the careful art of preserving food for the winter. As autumn cooled the winds and the first frosts silvered the grass, the Pomor villages turned their attention to the long work of preservation. The sea had given its bounty. Now it was time to ensure that nothing would be lost to the hunger of winter. The smokehouse stood at the edge of the village, a low building of thick logs, its walls darkened by years of fragrant smoke. Inside, fish hung from the ceiling on birchwood rods, slowly turning golden as the fire below smoldered day and night. Smoking was an art of patience. The fire was fed not with roaring flames, but with the slow burn of alder or juniper, woods that gave a sweet, clean smoke. Too much heat would cook the fish rather than cure it. Too little, and the meat might spoil. The Pomors knew the balance by instinct, tending the fire in shifts, their faces warmed by the glow as they murmured stories to pass the time. Some fish were salted first, packed in barrels for weeks to draw out moisture. Others went straight to the smoke, their flesh firm and rich with the oils of late summer. The result was balik, tender, smoky strips that could last for years if kept dry. Not all preservation required smoke. Some fish were simply split open and laid on wooden racks under the sun and wind, turning into yukola, a chewy, salty staple that could be eaten as it was or boiled into soups. The air near the drying ground smelled sharply of the sea, even miles inland. And then there was the sour, pungent treasure of fermented fish. Buried in pits or packed tightly in barrels, fish left to ferment became kislaya riba, a dish for those who acquired a taste. The process was simple: salt, thyme, and the quiet alchemy of bacteria. When done right, the flesh turned creamy, almost cheese-like, with a tang that cut through the monotony of winter meals. But fish was not the only food stored away. In the brief summer, women and children gathered berries from the tundra, cloudberries, lingonberries, crowberries, their hands stained purple as they piled baskets high. These were spread on cloths to dry, or sealed in barrels with a drizzle of honey, becoming jams that would brighten the darkest months. Mushrooms, too, were threaded onto strings and hung from rafters, their earthy scent mingling with the wood smoke. And from the few hardy crops that grew in the rocky soil, turnips, cabbage, onions, came barrels of sauerkraut, its sour crunch a welcome contrast to the richness of fish and game. Meals in winter were simple but never scarce. A typical supper might be a thick soup of dried fish and barley, enriched with a spoonful of fermented seal fat. Or perhaps slices of smoked salmon, chewy and dense, served with a dollop of sour cream and a piece of dark rye bread. The bread itself was another small miracle, baked in the great stove only once a week, its dense crumbs staying fresh for days. Some was set aside to dry into sukari, hard rusks that could be softened in broth or eaten like crackers with a bite of salted fish. Through all of this, the smoking, the drying, the fermenting, ran the unspoken understanding that winter was not to be feared if one prepared with care. The work was slow, repetitive, almost meditative, and when the first snows finally came, sealing the village in silence, there was a quiet satisfaction in looking at the full larder, knowing the sea's gifts would not be forgotten. In the next part, we will step away from the shore and into the forest, where the Pomors sought another kind of bounty: pine resin for torches, game for the stew pot, and the sacred birch, whose bark could be woven into baskets or even written upon. When the Pomors turned away from the sea, they did not find emptiness, but another kind of abundance, the deep, silent forests of the north. Here, beneath the endless sigh of wind through pine boughs, lay a different kind of sustenance. The trees gave more than wood. They gave light, medicine, and even stories. The birch was the most generous of these trees. Its papery bark could be carefully peeled away in spring when the sap ran thick beneath. Cut into strips and boiled, it became cordage, strong enough to stitch boots or lash together sled runners. Folded and sewn with spruce root, it transformed into waterproof containers for salt, dried fish, or precious tinder. But the birch's greatest gift was its ability to hold memory. On its smooth inner layers, the Pomors sometimes pressed symbols, crude maps, tallies of fish caught, or messages to those who might follow. These were not letters as the monks of Novgorod knew them, but a language of notches and curves, written in the quiet between people and the land. Deeper in the forest, the pine trees wept golden tears. Men would seek out the old scarred trunks where resin had pooled and hardened like amber. Gathered in leather pouches, these nuggets could be melted into glue for repairing boats, or pressed onto the tips of wooden splints to make torches. A single resin-soaked torch could burn for an hour, its sweet smoke driving away the worst of the midwinter darkness. Hunting was a quieter affair than fishing. In winter, men moved on long, curved skis through the snowdrifts, following the delicate tracery of fox or hare tracks. The bows they carried were short, made from laminated strips of birch and sinew, strong enough to bring down a reindeer, though such luck was rare. More often they returned with ptarmigan, their white winter feathers blending into the snow, or the occasional beaver taken from its dam. For those who knew where to look, the forest floor offered its own treasures. In late summer, women and children waded through the moss, their baskets filling with mushrooms, slippery ridgecay that turned almost orange when salted, bitter grusdi that needed long soaking before they could be eaten. The knowledge of which were safe was passed down not in books, but in warnings. The devil's mushroom wears a pretty skirt, they'd say of the deadly fly agaric, and always there was the gathering of firewood, not the quick snapping of dead branches, but the patient selection of seasoned logs. Birch burned fast and bright, pine gave long-lasting coals, but the true prize was the driftwood that washed ashore after storms. Salt-soaked and dense, it burned with eerie blue flames, its heat fierce enough to keep an isba warm through the longest night. The Pomors did not see the forest as wild. It was simply another kind of home, one that asked for respect in exchange for its gifts. A hunter might leave an offering of dried fish at the base of an ancient tree. A woman gathering herbs would always take less than half of what she found. The rules were unspoken, but understood. Next time, we will step into the dim glow of the winter isba, where spinning wheels hum and children learn the old crafts, where wood becomes spoons, hides become boots, and every object tells a story of patience. When winter sealed the Pomors inside their isbas, the long darkness became a time of making. Hands that spent summers hauling nets and autumn salting fish now turned to quieter tasks, shaping wood, twisting fiber, softening hides. There was no hurry. Each stroke of the knife, each turn of the spindle was a meditation against the cold. The men worked closest to the fire, where the light was best. A length of seasoned birch, cut the previous spring and dried near the ceiling, became a ladle. The craftsman's knife moved with practiced patience, hollowing the bowl, smoothing the handle until it fit perfectly in the hand. Such spoons were never just utensils. They were small masterpieces, their surfaces sometimes carved with winding vines or the sinuous shapes of fish. Larger projects waited in the corners, a new sled runner being bent over steam, the ribs of a future boat carefully shaped with adze and plane. Wood was never wasted. Even chips and shavings had their purpose, stuffed into leather pouches of tinder or burned to sweeten the air with piney smoke. Meanwhile, the women's hands were never still. Near the loom, where woolen cloth grew inch by inch, girls learned to spin with drop spindles made of whorl-weighted birch. The wool came from their own small flocks of northern sheep, whose coarse fleece was carded by hand before spinning, a task often done in company, with songs to keep time. But wool was not the only thread. From nettles gathered in summer came a surprisingly soft fiber, retted in dew and pounded until it could be spun into linen-like cord. This was the secret strength behind their nets, nearly invisible in water, yet strong enough to hold a thrashing cod. In another corner, hides soaked in a solution of oak bark and water, slowly transforming into supple leather. The tanning vat smelled sharply of tannin, a scent that clung to clothing for weeks. Once ready, the leather would be cut into soles for boots, laces for snowshoes, or pouches to keep salt dry. Nothing was thrown away. Even scraps became needle cases or patches for mending. Children had their own small tasks. A boy might spend hours rubbing a seal's tooth with a strip of sealskin, polishing it into a smooth amulet to ward off ill luck at sea. A girl practiced embroidery with reindeer sinew split into fine threads. Her needle traced traditional patterns onto a mitten's cuff, waves for safe travel, snowflakes for a mild winter. As the winter deepened, these objects accumulated. A new fish scaling knife with a handle of reindeer antler, a waterproof hat woven from spruce roots, a baby's cradle lined with the softest hair fur. Each was both practical and beautiful, for the Pomors knew that utility needed no ugliness. And always beneath the work ran a quiet understanding that these skills were more than chores. They were a language passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. To make something well was to speak love into being. Next time, we'll step into the flickering warmth of the banya, the bathhouse where sweat and steam washed away more than dirt, where birch branches stirred the air like whispers, and where the body and soul found renewal. In the heart of winter, when the world outside was a sculpture of ice and silence, the banya stood as a sanctuary, a place where warmth pooled like liquid gold, where muscles unknotted, and where the very breath seemed to soften in the lungs. The Pomors did not simply bathe here. They returned to themselves. The banya was built apart from the izba, a small log structure with an enormous stove at its center. Stones, carefully selected for their ability to hold heat, were piled atop the firebox. When the fire had burned down to embers, the door was sealed, and the waiting began, for the right moment when the heat would be fierce but not cruel. Entering was a ritual. First the outer door, then the antechamber where clothes were shed and the body acclimated. Finally, the inner door, thick to hold in heat, swung open, releasing a wave of dry warmth that prickled the skin. The benches rose in tiers. The higher one sat, the closer to the searing embrace of the rising heat. The venik, a bundle of birch branches gathered in summer and dried, was the banya's soul. Soaked in warm water until flexible, it was passed gently over the body, stirring the heat without striking. The leaves released their oils, a green perfume that spoke of forests beyond the frozen windows. Some preferred oak for its tannic strength, or added juniper for its sharp, cleansing bite. Then came the steam. Water, sometimes infused with beer or honey, was flung onto the stones. The explosion of heat was immediate, a thick, palpable thing that pressed into the pores, drawn out salt and weariness. Regulars knew to lie down, to let the heat settle over them like a second skin. Conversation here was sparse, murmured between rounds of steaming. Old men might speak of the spring fishing to come. Women shared remedies, how cloudberry tea could ease a cough, how pine resin salve healed cracks in wind-chapped hands. Secrets spilled as easily as sweat. Between rounds, they plunged into the pro-rub, a hole cut in the ice of the nearest stream. The shock was brutal, glorious, a reminder that the body was alive. Back in the banya, blood sang in the veins, and for a moment, even the oldest among them felt young again. After, in the cooling room, they drank, not strong vodka, but herbal infusions, rosehip for strength, lingonberry to soothe the kidneys, perhaps a dark brew of fermented chaga mushroom scraped from birch trunks. The tea was sipped slowly, the heat, internal now, radiating from the core. To the Pomors, the banya was more than cleanliness. It was rebirth, a shedding of the old year's weight, a preparation for the labor to come. Emerging into the star-flecked night, their skin glowing, they carried with them the certainty that winter too would pass. Next time, we'll walk the moonlit paths between villages. where traders carried news and goods on sleds pulled by reindeer, and where the boundaries between stranger and kin blurred beneath the northern lights. When winter's grip grew deepest, the Pomors did not retreat entirely. Instead, they adapted, transforming the frozen world into a highway. Rivers became roads, snowdrifts became signposts, and in the blue darkness, the creak of sled runners carried voices between villages that summer's mud had kept apart. The traders came first, their sleds piled with seal oil from the coast, smoked fish wrapped in birch bark, and the precious bundles of white hair pelts, so light, so warm. In return, they carried inland goods, iron nails forged in distant villages, sacks of rye flour for bread, and sometimes the rare luxury of honey, golden and thick from southern apiaries. But these journeys were not mere commerce. They were lifelines, carrying news of births, deaths, and marriages. A trader might deliver a message scratched on birch bark from a son who'd left for another settlement. Or he might bring word of a herring run spotted further down the coast, ensuring villages could prepare their nets in time. Travel required trust in more than just the ice. The Pomors kept Zirianka, waymarkers of piled stones or carved wooden posts, along known routes. Some were simple guides, others held small offerings beneath them, a dried fish, a twist of wool, left for good fortune by those who passed. To disturb these was unthinkable. The reindeer were the true masters of these journeys. Smaller and hardier than their southern cousins, they could break trail through snow that would swallow a man waist deep. Their broad hooves splayed to distribute weight on thin ice, and their hollow hair trapped warmth so completely that snow clinging to their coats never melted. At night, travelers built kota, temporary shelters of bent poles covered in reindeer hides. Inside, they huddled around small stone lamps fueled with seal oil, the flame just bright enough to warm hands and melt snow for tea. Conversation was hushed, often giving way to the silence of those deeply familiar with solitude. Dangers were ever present. Whiteouts could erase the world in minutes. Rotten ice lurked beneath innocent-looking snow, and sometimes the cold itself seemed a living thing, seeking gaps in wool and fur. The Pomors had a saying, "The frost is wiser than you." Never argue with it. Yet when the skies cleared and the northern lights shimmered overhead, there was magic in these journeys. To stand alone on a frozen sea under a vault of stars was to feel both insignificance and connection. To every village the lights touched, to every traveler who'd ever looked up and wondered, "Next time we'll slip beneath the waves with the Pomor divers, those who harvested the sea's hidden wealth from kelp forests and icy depths, where the line between courage and recklessness blurred with every breath held." Not all the Pomor's treasures were pulled from the sea in nets. Some required diving into the freezing embrace of the White Sea itself, where light filtered through ice in wavering columns, and the only sound was the hammering of one's own heart. The pearl divers were a special breed. They worked the shallow river mouths in late summer, where fresh-water mussels lurked in the sediment. Clad only in loose linen shirts to avoid entanglement, they would sink to the bottom, feeling blindly among the stones. Each dive lasted less than a minute, just long enough to snatch a few shells before surfacing, lips blue, to warm their hands over a smoldering birch bark fire. Most shells held only meat, dried and added to winter soups. But occasionally, there, a glint of nacre the size of a pea or smaller. These pearls were not the perfect spheres of southern waters, but baroque shapes with a peculiar frosty luster. Strung on horsehair threads, they became amulets for women in childbirth, or were traded inland for iron tools. Deeper divers sought the amber that sometimes washed up after storms, fragments of ancient resin that had wept from trees when mammoths still walked the earth. These golden crumbs were polished into beads or burned as incense, their piney smoke believed to ward off ill winds. But the most dangerous harvest came from the seal hunters. Venturing onto the pack ice in early spring, they waited motionless by breathing holes, their clubs carved from dense birch burl. When a seal surfaced, the strike had to be perfect, swift and sure. To wound but not kill was to invite the spirit of the sea's displeasure. Every part of the seal was used. The meat, rich with iron, was eaten raw or fermented. The fat rendered into oil for lamps that burned without smoke. The intestines, cleaned and stretched, became translucent windows for ice fishing shelters. Even the bones were carved into needles that grew slick with use, perfect for sewing waterproof seams. These hunters spoke little of their work. There were stories, of course, of shapes seen under thin ice that were too large to be seals, of voices calling from open lids in the fog. Some carried charms of rowan wood. Others made small daily offerings of fish scraps tossed backward into the sea, never looking to see what took them. Yet for all its dangers, the sea's hidden wealth was vital. A good pearl could buy a new iron kettle. A cache of amber might ransom a boat lost to the ice. And seal oil kept the lamps burning through the polar night, those small, flickering stars around which all winter life revolved. Next time, we'll sit at the edges of sleep, where dreams and reality blur, where the Pomor's tales of Vodanya spirits, shipwrecked souls, and the whispering dead were told in hushed voices as the fire burned low. When the lamps burned low and the winter night stretched its longest, the Pomors spoke of things unseen, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of those who knew the world was larger than what hands could touch. The sea had its moods, the forest its whispers, and in the liminal spaces where ice met water, where dreams spilled into waking, other voices sometimes answered. Every fisherman knew the rules. Never whistle on a boat, it called the wind, and the wind needed no encouragement. Never point directly at a seal, use your lips instead. A subtle gesture the Vodyanoi, the water spirit, might overlook. And if you found a dead seabird floating in your nets, a careful burial ashore with a pinch of salt between its feathers, lest its soul stir up storms. Dreams were messages waiting to be decoded. A dream of white horses galloping on waves meant good fishing ahead. A dream of losing teeth warned of a friend's betrayal. But the most dreaded was the dream of a loved one handing you water, for this meant they would soon drown. Some protections were simple. A rowan branch nailed above the door kept witches from stealing milk. A knife under the pillow guarded against nightmare spirits. But the strongest charms were made by the Tznakari, the village wise ones who could read the future in beeswax drippings or the patterns of burnt fish bones. Then there were the household spirits. The domovoi, a small hairy creature who lived behind the stove, would braid the manes of well-kept horses at night, but pinch slovenly servants black and blue. To keep him content, families left out bowls of porridge or scraps of felt for him to make slippers. But the sea spirits demanded more. When a drowned sailor washed ashore, the women would wash his body with water gathered from 3 waves, then bury him with a wooden cross laid at his feet, not to mark his grave, but to weigh him down. For the dead who were not anchored might walk the shoreline at dusk, their clothes still dripping with the sea's memory. Yet even these ghosts were not always feared. On certain nights, when the northern lights flickered green overhead, the Pomors said you could hear the lost fishermen singing, not mournful, but content. Their voices carried on waves no boat would ever sail again. Next time, in our final chapter, we'll stand at the edge of spring, where the ice groans as it breaks apart, where the first salt water of the year is sprinkled on newborn brows, and where the cycle begins anew. After the long inwardness of winter, the Pomor Coast stirred with the first sighs of spring. The ice did not leave all at once, but in stages, first darkening, then cracking, then breaking into great floating islands that groaned as they jostled against one another. The sea was returning. The work of spring was delicate. Boats needed inspecting, their tarred seams checked for winter's damage, their oars rubbed with linseed oil until they gleamed. Nets were spread on the bare patches of ground to dry, their repaired knots holding fast, and always the watching of the ice, judging when it was thin enough to avoid but thick enough to still walk upon for one last harvest of winter's gifts. The children were sent to gather solanitsa, the crystalline salt that formed along the shore where seawater had frozen and evaporated over and over. This first salt of the year was kept separate, used only to bless the first catch or to rub on a newborn's lips in the hope they would never know hunger. In the villages, the women prepared the vyajenka, a fermented milk drink saved for special occasions. The first sip was poured onto the hearth as thanks, the second given to the fisherman heading out to test the newly opened waters. His return would tell them what the year might bring. A boat heavy with cod meant prosperity, while a single red crab caught unintentionally was assigned to wait another week before proper fishing began. The animals, too, felt the change. Reindeer grew restless as their winter coats began to shed in gray tufts, collected to stuff pillows. Seals basked on the remaining ice floes, their dark eyes watching the human activity with mild interest. And overhead, the first migratory birds returned, eiders and barnacle geese, whose down would later line the jackets of those who collected it without disturbing the nests. At winter's end, the Pomors did not celebrate with feasts or music, but with quiet readiness. There were fish to catch, salt to harvest, another year's cycle to begin. The world here demanded neither gratitude nor lament, only attention, only the willingness to continue. And so we leave them there, at the edge of the ice and the beginning of the waves, where the horizon stretches clean and open, where every year is the same year, and every year is new.